My family owns a cabin up in the remote woods of Vermont. It's mostly a winter retreat for skiing and snowboarding, as it's located on a steep hill surrounded by thick forest. The nearest neighbors are a good distance up the road, far enough that you can't see their homes through the trees. On the property, there's a large shed where we store snowboarding gear, shovels, and other tools. The shed is always locked when we're not there, but during visits, we usually leave it unlocked for convenience. The cabin itself is 3 stories, with the top floor being a loft reserved for my parents. My siblings and I weren't allowed up there, but it was never an issue since there was plenty of space below. One particular weekend, I decided to head up there with a friend, Melissa. She'd never snowboarded before, so I offered to teach her on the smaller slope we had created on the property before taking her to the nearby mountain. We arrived late in the afternoon. The air was crisp, and the ground was covered in a thick blanket of snow. After unloading our gear, I unlocked the shed and grabbed some snowboards and protective gear. We decided to practice on the hill right away since the light was fading. I went first, demonstrating the basics, while Melissa followed, tumbling a few times but improving with each try. As we reached the bottom of the hill for the 3rd time, we both froze. A man's voice echoed faintly from the woods, calling, "Hello?" It wasn't loud, but it was close enough to hear clearly. We both scanned the tree line, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing but snow and shadows. I called back, "Who's there?" but got no response. The silence that followed was unnerving, and Melissa suggested we head back inside. I reassured her that it was probably a hiker or someone passing through, though deep down, I wasn't so sure. The nearest trail was miles away, and the area wasn't exactly a hotspot for casual walkers. Once inside, we locked the doors and decided to head into town for dinner at a nearby diner. By the time we returned, it was dark. We started a fire in the living room and settled in for the night. Melissa seemed to have forgotten about the earlier incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, as we were sitting by the fire, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. They were slow and deliberate, moving around the side of the house. I motioned for Melissa to be quiet as I turned off the music playing softly in the background. The footsteps stopped. Grabbing a flashlight, I moved to the window but couldn't see anything. When I called out, "Is someone there?" the woods seemed to swallow my voice. Melissa, visibly shaken, urged me to leave it alone and go back inside. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though neither of us slept well. The next morning, I woke to find Melissa already up, standing by the living room window. She pointed to the shed, where the door was slightly open. "Didn't you lock it?" she asked. I was sure I had. Grabbing my coat, I went out to check. The snow around the shed was undisturbed except for a fresh set of footprints leading in and out. Inside, everything seemed untouched: snowboards, tools, even an old radio we kept there. As I stood there, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. Turning quickly, I scanned the woods but saw nothing. Back inside, Melissa and I decided to continue with our plans for the day, hoping to distract ourselves. We headed to the mountain and spent hours snowboarding. By the time we returned, the sun had set, and the uneasiness from the morning had returned. After dinner, we decided to watch a movie, trying to keep things light. Around midnight, Melissa shook me awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her face pale. I listened, and sure enough, there it was, a voice, faint and strained, calling from outside. "Help me." It was drawn out and haunting, sending chills down my spine. Melissa begged me not to open the curtains, but I had to know what was out there. I carefully lifted one corner, peeking out into the dark. The snow reflected the moonlight, but there was no sign of anyone. Then I heard it again, footsteps, fast and approaching the window I was peering from. I slammed the curtain shut just as a loud knock rattled the glass. Melissa was crying softly, hiding under a blanket. "Stay quiet," I whispered, trying to keep my own voice steady. The knocking stopped, but the tension in the air was suffocating. For hours, we stayed frozen in place, waiting for the sound of footsteps or another knock, but none came. When morning finally arrived, I stepped outside to investigate. Footprints circled the cabin, stopping at every window before leading back into the woods. Whoever, or whatever, it was had been watching us all night. We decided to cut the trip short. After packing up, I made sure everything was locked before we left. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the trees. The next time my family went back to the cabin, everything seemed normal. The shed was intact, and nothing was missing. But I'll never forget that weekend. Being in such an isolated place and realizing you're not alone is a kind of terror you can't easily forget. Growing up, my dad always told me, "Fear the living, not ghosts. The living are the ones who can hurt you." His words stuck with me, but I never thought I'd put them to the test in such a chilling way. In my late teens, I inherited some money after my father's unexpected suicide. Along with it, I was left with memories too heavy to carry. Among his possessions was a cabin near Mount Bachelor in Oregon, which he and my mom had owned together. After his passing, my mom decided to sell it. The paperwork was nearly finalized, and the cabin would go on the market in less than a month. Until then, it would remain vacant. I saw this as an opportunity to escape. The weight of everything, the loss, the questions, the overwhelming grief, felt unbearable. So, I packed up my dad's old car, grabbed my snowboard, my dog Midnight, and enough supplies to last me a week. The first 2 days at the cabin were peaceful. I spent my mornings snowboarding and afternoons tossing snowballs with Midnight. By night, I indulged in simple pleasures, video games, music, and sitting on the balcony with a cigarette and a drink. It felt good to disconnect. The cabin itself was modest but cozy. The ground floor had a living room, a guest bedroom, and a small kitchen, while the upper floor had 2 more bedrooms and a master suite with a balcony. Most of my time was spent in the living room or the master bedroom. I kept the other rooms shut. On the 3rd day, the weather took a turn. A heavy snowfall blanketed the area, so I decided to stay in. That's when the unease began. Our cabin was nestled in a remote area, with only 2 other cabins nearby, both empty for the season. The nearest neighbors were over a mile away, surrounded by dense pine forests. Around midday, while playing outside with Midnight, I noticed footprints in the snow. They were fresh, no more than 20 or 30 minutes old, and circled the cabin before disappearing into the woods. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker had passed through. Still, the isolation of the place made it hard to shake the feeling that someone had been watching. That night, as I lay in bed, Midnight's ears perked up. He leapt off the bed and bolted downstairs. My heart raced as I listened to him pacing in the living room. After a few minutes, he came back, nudging me to let him outside. We stepped into the driveway, the cold biting at my skin. Midnight seemed unusually agitated, pulling on his leash and sniffing around the side of the house. His eyes kept darting toward the forest, where I'd seen the footprints earlier. Occasionally, he'd glance up at the roof. I couldn't see or hear anything unusual, but Midnight's behavior was unsettling. I dragged him back inside, locking the doors behind us. Later that night, just as I was starting to relax, I heard faint, deliberate footsteps on the roof. They sounded too measured to be an animal and too heavy for the snow to mask. Midnight ran to the balcony door, barking softly. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the balcony, scanning the roof. The snow was undisturbed. My breath fogged in the cold air as I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. That's when I saw it. In the tall pine tree about 20 feet away, something crouched between 2 branches. It was humanoid but grotesquely elongated, its limbs unnaturally thin. Its pale, almost translucent skin glowed faintly under the moonlight. Its long arms stretched above its head, gripping the branch above, while its face remained eerily expressionless, its mouth open, but silent. I froze, my mind racing to comprehend what I was seeing. Midnight's low growl behind me brought me back to reality. My instincts screamed at me not to shine the flashlight directly at it. Instead, I slowly backed into the cabin, pulling Midnight with me. Once inside, I locked the door and peered through the curtains. The thing was gone. That wasn't the end of it. Later that night, I heard tapping on the balcony door. It was light but incessant, like someone gently drumming their fingers against the glass. Midnight stared at the door but refused to approach it. An unexplainable sense of dread filled the room. It felt like whatever was outside wasn't just knocking, it was inviting me. My dad's voice echoed in my mind, "Fear the living, not ghosts." But this wasn't a person. I stayed in bed, paralyzed, until the tapping stopped. The night passed in a haze of fear, and as soon as the sun rose, I packed up and left. The cabin sold shortly after, and I never went back. To this day, I don't know what I saw, or if I even want to know. But I'll never forget that overwhelming feeling of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the door. My first serious snowboarding trip was with my friends Ashley, Samantha, and Haley. We all flew to Utah, excited to hit the slopes. We rented a cozy house on the outskirts of a small town near a popular mountain resort. It was winter, and everything about the trip seemed like it would be magical. Before this, I had only snowboarded once in my life, and even then, it was just repeatedly riding down the bunny hill. I wasn't great at it. We arrived late in the evening, and after settling into our rental, we decided to check out a nearby pub to relax after the flight. The next morning, we geared up, rented our equipment, and headed to the mountain. The first part of the day went okay. I stuck to the easier green slopes to get my footing, while my friends went off to explore more challenging runs. By the afternoon, they convinced me to try a blue run, a step up in difficulty. I wasn't confident but agreed to give it a shot. From the start, it was clear I wasn't ready. I kept falling, and after what felt like my 20th tumble, I gave up and sat down on the side of the slope to catch my breath. That's when a man, also struggling on his snowboard, approached me. He asked if I was okay and then started asking other random questions. It felt weird, this wasn't the place to strike up a conversation. I mumbled some short answers, then got back on my board and continued down the mountain. A bit further down, I had to stop again. My legs were exhausted, and I was beyond frustrated. To my surprise, the same man appeared again. He was wobbling his way down the slope and eventually stopped near me. This time, he unstrapped his snowboard and sat just a few feet away. He started making strange comments, like how he wasn't used to seeing pretty girls like me on the mountain. It was odd, considering I was fully covered with a helmet and ski mask. Then he asked who I was with. Feeling uncomfortable, I lied and said my boyfriend. He smirked and replied, "I saw you arrive with just girls." That response gave me chills. I quickly strapped into my board, muttered "Ew," and sped down the mountain as fast as I could. Adrenaline must have kicked in because I managed to get to the bottom without falling once. At the lodge, I immediately called one of my friends, Samantha, and explained what had happened. She joined me at a table, and we decided it was best to leave. By the time our other friends, Ashley and Haley, returned from their runs, it was nearly 3 p.m. We returned our rental gear and headed back to the house. That evening, we tried to shake off the unsettling incident. After showering and changing, we went out for dinner in town and then explored a few bars. By the time we got back to the house, we were buzzed but in good spirits. We all hopped into the hot tub on the deck, sipping on more drinks and laughing about random things. Eventually, we went to bed. I've always had trouble sleeping, so I stayed up scrolling through TikTok for at least an hour. The house was silent, and I was still a little tipsy but far from tired. That's when I heard faint footsteps in the common area outside my room. At first, I assumed it was one of the girls going to the bathroom or getting a drink, but the sound didn't stop. Then, I heard my doorknob jiggle. My heart froze. I sat up, about to call out one of their names, but something stopped me. Why would one of them try to open my door without knocking? I grabbed my phone and quickly texted our group chat, "Who's walking around? Are you okay?" No one responded. I put my ear to the door and heard the faint creak of footsteps moving around the house. Carefully, I unlocked my door and opened it just a crack to peek into the living room. The dim light from outside revealed a tall, shadowy figure moving from one bedroom door to another, testing the handles. It wasn't one of the girls. I shut my door quietly and locked it again, my hands trembling. I called 911 and whispered everything to the operator, explaining that someone had broken in. While I was on the phone, I heard light knocks on my door, followed by the knob twisting again. My stomach dropped. The operator kept telling me to stay calm and quiet, but the intruder began pushing against the door, trying to force it open. I couldn't hold back anymore. I screamed, "Get out of here! I'm on the phone with the police." The banging stopped, and I heard a male voice on the other side say, "Okay, sweetheart." His tone was chillingly calm. Then, I heard his footsteps retreating. The operator instructed me to stay in my room until the police arrived. I peeked out of my window but couldn't see much, it was pitch black outside. My friends, now awake from my screams, started messaging in the group chat, asking what was happening. I told them to stay in their rooms and lock their doors. The police arrived within 10 minutes, bursting into the house. The front door had been left unlocked, which made me sick to my stomach. After confirming the intruder was gone, the officers helped us secure all the doors and windows before leaving. None of us slept well that night. The next day, we all agreed to cut our trip short. We contacted the Airbnb host, who apologized profusely and offered a partial refund. Instead of returning to the slopes, we spent Sunday exploring the nearby town and stayed at a small motel that night. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the man from the slopes was the same one who broke into our house. His voice sounded eerily familiar. What started as an exciting trip turned into a terrifying experience I'll never forget.